The night in Tokyo glittered with flashbulbs, endless applause, and a roar that echoed inside the arena. Carlos Alcaraz, only 22 years old and already perched at the very top of world tennis, had just lifted another ATP 500 trophy. Cameras captured his smile, his every gesture, and the sense of inevitability that followed him wherever he competed. Once again he had conquered. Once again, the young Spaniard had proven that he was the man to beat in the sport. But behind that radiant smile, there was something else, something heavier, quieter, and far more consequential. Sitting before the press after his victory, he chose words that sliced through the euphoria of celebration. In a calm tone, but with unmistakable force, Alcaraz declared, "I have to consider whether in the future I should skip some of the mandatory tournaments." For a moment, the room froze. Reporters stopped typing. Cameras paused. It wasn't the kind of plea you hear from an aging veteran on his way out. Nor was it the impatience of a teenager unprepared for the demands of the tour. These were the words of the current world #1, the brightest new face of men's tennis, spoken at the peak of his power. Words that questioned the very structure on which the professional circuit has been built for decades. And suddenly, what had been a night of joy transformed into the opening salvo of a much bigger debate. Because what Alcaraz had touched was not personal frustration. It was the open wound that tennis has carried for generations. Its brutal, relentless calendar. A calendar that stretches almost 11 months without reprieve. A calendar that begins in January under the scorching heat of Australia, jumps across continents, and finally ends in late November with Davis Cup or Billie Jean King Cup finals. Between one season and the next, there is little more than a whisper of recovery time. What made his statement even more striking was the immediate context. In his very first match in Tokyo, Alcaraz had twisted his ankle. He kept playing, fighting through the pain, and ultimately claimed the trophy. But the cost was evident. Only days later, he confirmed his withdrawal from the Shanghai Masters 1000. His reason was brutally simple. He needed rest. And by pulling out of a major tournament, Alcaraz made something clear, that even the youngest, strongest, and most resilient body cannot carry on without pause. For some, this decision seemed shocking. But the numbers paint a stark picture. By October of 2025, Alcaraz had already played 74 matches. He had competed in every major event, all 4 Grand Slams, Masters in Indian Wells, Miami, Monte Carlo, Rome, Cincinnati, plus ATP 500 campaigns in Rotterdam, Doha, Barcelona, Queens, and now Tokyo. The schedule was stacked, and it wasn't even over. Still ahead were Paris, the ATP Finals, Davis Cup, and even a high-profile exhibition in Saudi Arabia. It is not only the volume of matches but also the brutal transitions that make the tour punishing. One week it's the fast, hard courts of Asia demanding explosive movement. The next, it's the clay of Europe requiring endless rallies. Then it's the grass of England where agility and precision dominate. Each surface asks for a different game, a different physical demand, and players are expected to adjust instantly. The body rarely has time to recover before the next set of demands arrives. This is the paradox of professional tennis. The very system designed to keep fans engaged around the globe has created an invisible cage for its stars. The higher a player climbs, the less freedom he has. Success, paradoxically, ties the athlete more tightly to a system that celebrates endurance while punishing rest. And now, with Alcaraz, that paradox stands exposed. His words carry an authority that cannot be brushed aside. Rafael Nadal once lamented his knees, Federer carefully skipped clay seasons to prolong his career, and Serena Williams called the women's calendar unreasonable. Their voices mattered, but they often sounded like the reflections of players nearing the twilight of their careers. Alcaraz is different. He is 22, the reigning #1, the player expected to lead the sport into its next golden decade. If he is already sounding the alarm, then the alarm is real. What he delivered in Tokyo was not a complaint. It was a warning. A warning that stretches beyond his own career, one that touches every player, every fan, and the very future of tennis itself. Carlos Alcaraz's warning in Tokyo may feel like a new story, but in reality, it is a familiar echo. The tennis calendar has always been both the engine and the executioner of careers. Across eras, champions have risen, conquered, and eventually broken down under the weight of its demands. The difference today is that the world #1 of a new generation is saying it out loud. Rafael Nadal is perhaps the clearest example of this paradox. His legacy as one of the greatest fighters in sports history was built on unmatched intensity, yet that very intensity was exploited by a calendar that gave him little room to breathe. Nadal openly admitted that the relentless pace aggravated his chronic knee problems. His team often patched him up with injections, treatments, and sheer grit, but every triumph came with a physical bill. There were moments when his career seemed destined to end years earlier than it should have, all because the calendar left him no escape. Roger Federer took a different path. The Swiss genius recognized that no body, no matter how graceful, could withstand the grind forever. In the later stages of his career, Federer began to strategically skip entire clay court seasons. Critics accused him of dodging challenges, but his decisions extended his career, preserved his body, and allowed him to remain competitive into his late 30s. It was not cowardice, it was survival. Novak Djokovic, meticulous in every aspect of his preparation, also made selective sacrifices. He once skipped Madrid entirely to focus on Roland Garros. His strategy was always about targeting peaks of performance, not trying to survive the endless demands of every week. And Serena Williams, a global icon, spoke repeatedly about how the WTA calendar was unreasonable for athletes who were also trying to balance recovery, family, and longevity at the top level. Then there is Andy Murray, whose story is as inspiring as it is heartbreaking. Known for his stubborn resilience, Murray drove his body past its limits to stay competitive against the legends of his era. The result was brutal: multiple hip surgeries that nearly ended his career. His comeback has been admirable, but his body will never fully escape the damage of years spent fighting the system as much as his opponents. Maria Sharapova, another superstar, complained about how the mandatory events prevented her from managing recurring shoulder problems. The structure gave her no room to choose tournaments that suited her recovery. Naomi Osaka, one of the brightest stars of her generation, stepped away citing mental health pressures, a different, but equally devastating consequence of the unrelenting circuit. And history offers even more reminders. Bjorn Borg, who once seemed destined to dominate for a decade, retired at just 26. Burned out, exhausted by the constant travel and competition, he simply walked away. Monica Seles, after her traumatic hiatus, admitted that the pace of the tour upon her return was almost impossible to handle. Even Pete Sampras, often considered the perfect champion of the 1990s, was criticized for skipping some Masters events, but his choices were the reason he was able to last long enough to accumulate his legendary haul of Grand Slam titles. The thread that ties all these stories together is the same. The calendar rewards constant sacrifice but punishes rest. The ATP and WTA ranking system only intensifies this. Unlike team sports where coaches rotate players, tennis players carry the entire burden alone. To stay at the top, they must defend points earned the previous year. Miss a tournament and the points vanish. Even if the absence is for rest or recovery, the ranking punishes it brutally. That is why skipping events feels so dangerous. It is not seen as a strategic choice but as a step backward, a risk that could unravel months of work. Players are trapped in a cycle where rest equals vulnerability. Alcaraz knows this better than anyone right now. He holds 11,350 ranking points. But Jannik Sinner, his closest rival, is closing the gap with consistent victories. Had Alcaraz defended his points in Shanghai, his lead would have felt secure. Instead, skipping the tournament could reduce his advantage to just a few hundred points before Paris. In a sport where every detail matters, that kind of margin can decide who ends the year on top. The dilemma is clear: protect your body, or protect your throne. For many champions of the past, protecting their throne eventually broke their bodies. Murray's hip, Thames injuries, Osaka's struggles, all reminders that the system rarely forgives. What makes Alcaraz different is that he is refusing to play quietly by the same rules. He is not hiding his doubts or keeping them confined to whispers in the locker room. He is speaking publicly, framing his decision not as a personal sacrifice but as a systemic problem. In doing so, he is transforming what was once an individual burden into a collective debate that the sport can no longer dismiss. The tennis calendar has always been a double-edged sword. It fuels the sport's global presence, but it slowly destroys its heroes. And now, with the brightest star of the new generation shining a spotlight on its flaws, the question is unavoidable. The tennis calendar is not simply a schedule of matches. It is the backbone of a global business model worth billions. Every tournament slot, every week on the calendar, represents money, ticket sales, broadcasting rights, sponsorship deals, and the economic impact on host cities. This structure is what keeps the sport financially alive, but it is also the very reason it resists change. For tournament organizers, the presence of top players is everything. Tickets are sold months in advance based on the promise that fans will see Alcaraz, Djokovic, Swiatek, or Goff in action. Sponsors invest millions for the visibility that only comes when the biggest names are on the court. Broadcasters pay astronomical sums for rights deals, banking on the guarantee that they will be able to show the sport's brightest stars week after week. This fragile ecosystem means that when a player withdraws, the ripple effect is immediate. Attendance drops, television ratings dip, local economies that invested in hosting suffer. Organizers, fearing these consequences, pressure governing bodies to enforce strict participation rules. The ATP mandates that top 30 players must appear in 4 Grand Slams, 8 Masters 1000 events, and at least 5 ATP 500 tournaments. The message is clear: the sport cannot afford for its stars to rest. In theory, this ensures that fans around the world always get their chance to see the best. In practice, it's a trap. Players are pushed to compete even when their bodies are screaming for relief. The product might shine in the short term, but the long-term costs are devastating. An injured or burned-out star is far worse for the sport's visibility than the absence of a single event. The paradox is glaring. The same system designed to maximize tennis's global reach risks undermining its very foundation. Without stars, the business collapses. Yet the calendar is built in a way that slowly breaks those stars down. Consider the expansion into Asia. Events in Shanghai, Beijing, and Tokyo have become financial juggernauts, backed by powerful sponsors and governments eager to showcase their cities. But this expansion added even more strain to an already packed schedule. Players are now expected to crisscross continents, switching surfaces with barely a week in between, to satisfy commercial contracts and market demands. Every stakeholder defends their territory. European clay tournaments refuse to lose their traditional spots. North American hard courts are fiercely protected. The Asian swing is non-negotiable because of the money it brings. No tournament is willing to step aside, and so the calendar stretches, suffocating those who must endure it. The ranking system makes it worse. Unlike in team sports, where rotation and substitution can protect athletes, tennis players are alone. The ATP and WTA ranking systems are based on defending points from the previous year. If a player skips an event, those points vanish. The punishment is automatic, regardless of whether the absence is strategic or necessary for recovery. Rest becomes not just a physical risk, but a professional one. This system rewards constant presence, but at the cost of health. It traps players in a cycle where they feel compelled to compete, not always to win, but simply to defend what they have already earned. For someone like Alcaraz, skipping Shanghai could mean losing hundreds of points and shrinking his lead over Sinner. That decision may cost him the year-end #1, even if it protects his body for the long term. The truth is that the tennis business model prioritizes continuity over sustainability. Other sports have found ways to balance both. Formula One, for example, has a long and exhausting season, yet still enforces a winter break for recovery and preparation. Basketball and baseball span many months, but they include off-seasons that allow athletes to heal and train. Tennis remains an outlier, 11 months of relentless travel and competition, with only a handful of weeks to recover before the cycle restarts. The governing bodies argue that the constant presence of tennis keeps it unique. The sport never disappears from television screens, never loses momentum, never gives fans the chance to forget it. But that constant presence is also its greatest danger. Stars who are pushed too hard burn out, retire early, or vanish for months due to injury. And when that happens, the financial engine they were meant to power suddenly sputters. This is why Alcaraz's words matter so much. He has pulled back the curtain on the central contradiction of modern tennis. The business that thrives on visibility is sabotaging the very players it depends on. His statement forces the question into the open. Can tennis truly sustain itself if it continues to consume its champions? Tennis now stands at a crossroads. What Carlos Alcaraz said in Tokyo was not just the frustration of one young champion. It was a warning that reaches to the very core of the sport. The question is simple, yet monumental. Will tennis continue down the same path, or will it finally reform to protect its brightest stars? Several proposals have already been discussed. One of the most direct solutions is reducing the number of mandatory tournaments. At present, Top players are bound to 4 Grand Slams, 8 Masters 1000s, and at least 5 ATP 500 events. That structure leaves almost no room for rest. Cutting even 1 or 2 obligations could open precious breathing space for athletes to manage their schedules without fearing punishment. Another reform idea is reorganizing the calendar geographically. Instead of forcing players to leap from continent to continent in a matter of days, tournaments could be grouped to minimize travel and surface transitions. This system already exists in part: clay events in Europe, grass in England, but extending that logic across the full season would reduce physical stress and create a more natural flow. Then there's the ranking system itself. The current points defense model punishes inactivity harshly. Many experts suggest a more flexible approach, counting only a player's best results over a set number of tournaments, rather than docking points when they miss an event. This would reward performance, not just constant presence. It would also allow players to take strategic breaks without losing their hard-earned positions. The most ambitious proposal involves carving out a real off-season. Shortening the calendar by even 1 or 2 months could give players time to heal, train, and recharge properly. Critics argue this would cost tournaments revenue, but supporters insist that healthier players and longer careers would generate far more value in the long run. After all, what is more profitable? A short-term gain from one extra event, or the longevity of superstars who can headline the sport for over a decade? Of course, resistance remains fierce. Every tournament protects its place, every sponsor defends its investment, every broadcaster demands constant content. The inertia of tradition and economics weighs heavily. But what Alcaraz has done is change the terms of the conversation. By speaking publicly, he has forced tennis to confront the contradiction at its core. And this brings us to the double climax. The first is sporting. Alcaraz, only 22, is already withdrawing from key tournaments because his body is at risk. If the most resilient new champion cannot endure the schedule, then no one can. The second is structural. The calendar, once seen as the backbone of tennis, is being revealed as its greatest liability. If the sport does not adapt, it risks burning out its future before that future can even unfold. The consequences of inaction are clear. Imagine Alcaraz, Sinner, Rune, or other rising stars breaking down before they reach their 30s. Imagine careers cut short, rivalries never fully realized, and fans robbed of the epic narratives that make the sport more than just a game. The loss would not only be athletic, it would be cultural. Tennis thrives on legends that span decades, on rivalries that define eras. Without longevity, those stories cannot exist. But the opportunity is equally clear. If reform happens, tennis could enter a golden age of sustainability. Players could compete at their best for longer, creating rivalries that stretch over years, perhaps even decades. Fans would not just see brilliance in flashes, but witness careers that evolve, battles that mature, and histories that endure. Sponsors and broadcasters, too, would benefit from the stability of stars who remain at the center of the sport for far longer. This is the choice tennis now faces: short-term revenue versus long-term survival. And it is a choice that cannot be delayed much longer. The alarm bell has already rung, sounded not by a tired veteran, but by the sport's brightest young champion. In Tokyo, Carlos Alcaraz didn't just lift a trophy, he lifted a mirror to the sport itself. What he reflected was uncomfortable, but undeniable. The calendar that sustains tennis may also be the calendar that destroys it. Backhand index pointing right, and here's our closing call. If you want to follow how this battle unfolds, how Alcaraz's warning could reshape the entire sport, and what it means for the next decade of tennis, stay with us at World New Tennis. Because this isn't just about one player's schedule, it's about the future of the game we all love.